So yesterday was all about Italy, the country that's too big to bail. But the markets are doing the sums on who's carrying what Italian paper. And oh dear, the French banks are in deep. And the spread between France's sovereign bonds and German bunds is creeping up. Well, I'm joined now from London by James Shugg, senior economist at Westpac International Bank. James, I guess the word from my end is truth. I mean, Rome is burning and Brussels is still fiddling, seemingly.
Yes, good evening, Tiki. You could say also, I suppose, that Frankfurt is still fiddling. That is, that the European Central Bank is only fiddling around at the edges of the European bond markets. We have actually heard that the ECB has been in there buying Italian bonds today, and that's why the 10-year bond yields have come down a bit to around 7.1%. However, what is really needed is a commitment by the ECB to say that they stand ready to buy in huge amounts, maybe €1 trillion worth of Italian and other sovereign bonds in Europe to show that they're really serious about keeping the bond yields down so that the debt loads of these governments can still be financed at a time when they're heading into recession because of the austerity measures that are being imposed. But the Germans are saying, no, we can't actually allow that to happen. So that's a big risk for Europe going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the Germans, I noticed that today the Bundesbank chief, who is the dominant governor, of course, in the ECB, is vehemently opposed to the bailout. He says it's going to lead to the sort of Weimar-style hyperinflation. The Germans really fear that, don't they, from a historical point of view?
They do, but I think that's an unreasonable fear given that Europe's heading into a recession. I think declining inflation is the big risk going forward. We've just had a few minutes ago the European Commission publish their new forecasts for Europe. They do it every 6 months, and they're wildly optimistic. They've downgraded their view for Europe for next year from 1.9% growth to 0.5% growth, but they've even got economies like Italy still growing, albeit only at 0.1%. We think a more reasonable forecast for Europe for next year is something like a 0.5% decline in output. Quite a decent recession, unfortunately. Even the ECB's implied there's going to be a recession next year. The OECD is saying there's going to be a recession in Europe next year. So it's pretty outrageous that the European Commission's come up with these unrealistically positive forecasts. It doesn't help sort out the problem. And
so much for firewalls. We're now seeing this contagion with the French and German 10-year yield spread widening. What's that saying about France?
Well, I think what it's telling you is that because French and German leaders last week crossed the Rubicon, as it were, and actually talked about the possibility of the euro being pulled apart, of countries maybe leaving the euro, we've got the situation now where rather than the euro being a combination of more or less equals, at least in the core, now people are saying, well, there's Germany and there's all the rest. And there's even, speculation that possibly, in the worst of all possible worlds, you could see, euro splitting up involving, the French even leaving. And that's why you're seeing the yield spreads widen. People are now viewing them as more separate entities in a looser union of currencies rather than irrevocably locked in the euro, which was the situation up until a couple of weeks ago.
I mean, last week it was the idea that Greece might have to default, and now there seems to be talk about very definitely a two-tier Europe with perhaps France and Germany planning for a smaller Eurozone, talks going on between them, and then perhaps the pigs in the south having to leave the euro altogether. Can you see that scenario eventuating?
Absolutely catastrophic if it were to happen. I mean, you'd have to have men with guns at the borders preventing people from taking their currency to the stronger parts of Europe. You'd see the huge runs on the banks, which would have been banking system failures right across the southern parts of Europe. You'd see recession, you'd see hyperinflation, you'd see chaos, and you'd see failed states. I just don't see that as an alternative.
Even if that is a catastrophic alternative, I mean, this is the great irony, because Italy itself is not insolvent. Its public debt is stable at 120% of GDP. Its household debt is actually low at about 40% of GDP. It's been the euro that's actually got it into this mess in the first place, hasn't it?
Well, you could argue that they went into the euro at too high an exchange rate, which has eroded their competitiveness. And at the same time, when interest rates fell to German levels, it became the economy continued to grow at quite a decent pace, and that allowed it to let costs rise. So unit labour costs have made it even more uncompetitive. That's the point you make is right, though. Italy is not insolvent, but it does have an accumulation of foreign debt that needs to be serviced, and it can't service it effectively if the economy is receding. Yet it needs to put in place structural reforms that will bring with it short-term economic pain. That's why I think it's important for the ECB to step in and stand ready to buy the bonds of Italy, to hold down yields so it can get through this period of adjustment and become a more efficient economy. It's the only possible solution I can see.
In order to do that, to convince the Germans, finally, do you see a lot of work happening at the APEC summit? There is talk perhaps that the US and that China will jointly approach Angela Merkel and say, this has to be done, you've got to sort it out.
It can only help. Whether or not it's enough, I just don't know. Look, the Germans have to ask themselves this question: are we serious about the euro? Because the euro is not going to exist in its current form without us changing our views on how the ECB operates. You've got this hugely powerful institution that is not allowed to do what it should be doing to help prevent the worst of all possible outcomes for Europe in 2012.
James Shugg, what a time to be in your job. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Ticky.